We are going to start the afternoon of day 2 of TIGS with a panel on why representation matters to mental health. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all. We touched on a lot of these issues earlier today, and so it's going to be really great to have a full hour to dedicate to this conversation. And so I will pass it off to all of you. I'm going to step away from this panel because I don't need to be here. Have a lot of fun.
Right. Hi, everyone. Eve is actually not your moderator. I am. My name is Tanya DePass. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some discussion. And I believe we have 15 minutes for Q&A once we're done talking. So I'm going to go in the order that I see everyone on my screen. I'm not sure what order you see everyone else. Ika, why don't you go first?
Hi, everyone. Eka. I'm the co-founder and studio director at Outer Loop Games in Seattle area. I've been making games for 23 years and started up Outer Loop to focus on making games about people that are underrepresented, like myself.
Me too.
Hey, really glad to be here, especially being on a panel with so many wonderful people and friends. So hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Mitu Khandaker. I'm the CEO of Glow Up Games. I'm also a professor of game design at NYU Game Center. And with Glow Up Games specifically, so Glow Up Games is a games company. We're making mobile games specifically targeting women of color first and underrepresented players. And one of the things that we also realized in sort of, my co-founder Latoya Peterson and I in starting the company, we're sort of in this ecosystem where we're, pitching to venture capitalists, trying to sort of go through that sort of games funding ecosystem. And one of the things we realized, especially if you're looking in the sort of $77 billion mobile game side of things, is that women are considered a monolith, right? So like women are 68% of the mobile games market, but it's like, we have no idea how many of those players are women of color because the industry just doesn't care about us. So one of the things that we're also doing at Glow Up Games is trying to collect data on women of color as players as well. So I'm looking forward to diving into the discussion with all of you today.
Manveer.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here. Good to see everybody. My name is Manveer Heir. I am the co-founder, president, and chief visionary officer at Brass Line Entertainment. And much like Mitu and Eka, our studio is focused on making diverse products, whether it be games, TV, film, podcasts, and other forms of media that kind of represent on the marginalized groups. So we're focused initially on Black and Brown communities, but we want to tackle that intersectionally and care about the people at the margins and the intersections of those and tell those kind of original stories. And so, yeah, it's much like Eka and Mitu, kind of in that startup mode of having to do it myself. Before this, I worked at BioWare on the Mass Effect franchise most famously. And after 12, 13 years of doing that, of working in the AAA industry, it just became very evident that I had to start something on my own to be able to make the changes that I needed to see in my work environment.
Sachin.
Hi, everyone. Really honored to be here with you all. My name is Sachin. My pronouns are he, him. I'm of Indian origin, which I think is important for this discussion. I don't normally volunteer that. And I am a psychiatrist. So I work in London as a mental health doctor, basically. And I'm more relevantly part of a UK charity called Gaming the Mind, which is composed of mental health professionals who are basically raising positive mental health awareness through games and the games industry. And we've worked with various sectors, but I won't bore you with that. But the title of this panel really interested me just in terms of, can representation actually improve someone's mental health? And I looked into it, and I hope to construct a good narrative of how that's possible, but I also just really want to hear everyone's experiences.
And I'm your moderator, Tanya DePass. So if you've seen I Need Diverse Games anywhere online, that was me being mad about video games around 6 in the morning, now 6 years ago. I also do a lot of D&D, a lot of other tabletop work, and recently started doing my own games as well. Into the Motherlands is a new game and actual play that is started as of last week. And I started I Need Diverse Games because I got very tired of not seeing myself in the games that I play. And in thinking about everyone's intro, why did you even say yes to this panel? Because we talk about this stuff all the time. And while it's important, it's yet another conversation for a gaze of people who may or may not get it. So why'd you say yes?
I can volunteer that first. So, I mean, for me, it's funny because I don't talk about mental health enough publicly. And I feel like that's something that I, from a personal level, want to work to change. And I think, you know, I'm sure some other folks here are going to feel me on this. Like the Desi community is just terrible at talking about mental health. And that's really how I was raised. And, you know, so I'm of, you know, British Asian, Bangladeshi background. You know, it's not a conversation that our communities are good at having at all. And I'm still to this day, I mean, you know, we'll get into this, but I'm still to this day unpacking some of the trauma of that, quite frankly, and some of the trauma of that experience. So I think that, you know, I'm really pleased to be here. And, you know, at this point in my career, be able to talk about these things.
Cool.
Yeah, very much in the same manner. You know, our communities are not great about talking about this. So I come from a family of people with bipolar disorder. My brother took his life almost a decade ago. I've been dealing with depression and anxiety the last 3-4 years since kind of I left BioWare and kind of had a burnout there. So for me, like there is no forward in this industry if I don't take care of my mental health. And I can't take care of my mental health if I'm trying to hold it all in and not talk about it and share and try to, you know, find the best ways to maneuver. You know, I'm very fortunate to have great friends, including people on this panel like Eka and Mitu. We've talked about this stuff privately. So talking about it publicly amongst people who I already know and trust, and Tanya as well, you know, makes sense to me. And, you know, I think as a society, we need to kind of destigmatize these sorts of conversations, not just, you know, as gamers, but in our individual, you know, communities, whether it be Desi communities that maybe don't talk about these sorts of things, or Black communities, Latino, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I want to add to what Mitu and Manveer said. I mean, I've talked about this privately, but like I think it's for a long time I've been in a survivor mode, just not realizing it. Being in the industry, and you know, I grew up in Sri Lanka, immigrated to the U.S. When I was younger, and been in games for a long time. And I think for a long time, we don't talk about a lot of the stuff at home, and really being able to talk about this publicly is a thing I'm trying to do a lot more these days.
Sachin, do you have anything to add before we move on?
Sure. I mean, I just reiterate, I mean, it's very interesting as a subject. And also, I'm just so glad that you all are talking about this openly. I can back up as well that research varies differently on whether certain ethnic groups experience mental health at different rates to white people, but certainly we have worse outcomes, and there's various reasons for that, but one of them I can totally back up is that we address it within our own communities in a different way. And often there's a lot of stigma around that, and we have different hurdles to overcome in overcoming that kind of stigma. But also just this topic in general, I was thinking about, can representation within games really help our mental health? And yeah, mental health is affected by our brains, by our psychology, and by social factors. So yeah, social factors such as media might have an effect. And the best example I can come up with is eating disorders, which are definitely fueled by the media we observe and the type of bodies we see on screen. So if not that, then why not other things as well?
And for me, I accepted, because I also forgot my introduction, I am a Take This ambassador, because we just don't talk about it openly as much as I'd like to in Black communities. Even when my mom was still alive and we tried to talk about grief therapy, she just wouldn't hear of it. And I got very much that's not a thing we do, that is something white folks do. And it's like, well, I still am grieving, so I still need to deal with this. And it's just one of those things where it's like, it's an opportunity to talk about it. And, you know, since we're talking about this in terms of representation, when I say it, I'm talking about something that's good, not just we color swapped someone into a brown palette and here's your representation. I mean, when you can tell that someone Black or POC was involved in the creation of a character, of a game, and it comes through very clearly, what does that mean for you in terms of mental health versus the 99.9% of games and other media that we get that is just all white produced or aimed at a white gaze? Because frankly, a lot of people just act like we either don't exist or that we should be glad for crumbs.
I want to tackle this from a design perspective at the very minimum, which would be, you know, a lot of games, they kind of give you either a blank avatar or a character to customize. You know, I worked on the Mass Effect franchise, and you could make your Shepard look like however you wanted to. And so one of the first things I did was make him look like a darker skinned, didn't look exactly like me because I wasn't trying to make myself, but like somebody who I could relate to a little bit more. And I think we're all looking for that level of relatedness that allows us to kind of embody that character and then that world that we're in. And I think it's important. And then when you're coming from communities that are completely underrepresented in the medium, it's really difficult to find it in a multitude of games. And so when you find it in even just one game, you sometimes gravitate towards that even when it's not the game you love the most because of that aspect. So like, I don't know, you know, the clinical side of it and any of this, but as a designer, I always just think like, what are the tools I can give players for them to feel like they embody these characters and are kind of living this world and kind of engrossed in this world. And I think representation has to be there because we live in a global multicultural society nowadays. You know, the advent of social media with all of its negatives has a bunch of positives, which is groups are able to start finding each other that weren't, you know, usually finding each other, have voices, speak out, and, you know, kind of gain stature, power, or at least, you know, some amount of influence as a result of that. And I think now we're finally realizing, you know, as a industry, that we need to be catering towards these people, you know, and if you want to be very, you know, crass about it, from a business perspective, you need to be catering to these people. And then for people, I think for everybody on this panel, it's just, it hits home for us. Like, this is our lived experiences. Like, as you know, Asians, South Asians who grew up, for me, I grew up in the US and right outside Washington, DC. You're not used to seeing yourself in anything, right? Like, all I saw myself was Apu, the savage Indians in Indiana Jones, which then got me asked why don't I eat monkey brains at the lunch table in elementary school, and things like that. So like, you know, this America specifically is a very black and white society, and finding all the kind of grays in between is important, and it's important to include all of these sorts of things, and then look outside of race as well for the marginalization and the other ways to kind of tackle this.
Mm-hmm.
So to chime in on, yeah, you know, it's funny what you said, Tanya, about because, you know, we're very much in pitching mode right now at Glow Up Games. And so, you know, it's like very often that we'll go and talk about what we do, myself and Latoya, and people will bring up the assumption that people have is that, oh, we're just making like existing kinds of games and just sticking a black or brown avatar in there and just, you know, color swapping it, and that's fine. And we're like, no, that's not what we're about. To give you an example, so the first game that we're making as a studio is the official tie-in game for HBO's hit TV show Insecure. So we are very lucky to be doing that, very grateful to be doing that. And, you know, in the sense of being able to support a show, the ecosystem of a show that is very much about just like, you know, this young Black woman living in South LA. And, you know, one of the things about the show, the themes of the show itself, is about showing up for yourself and showing up for your friends. And we wanted to very much mechanically recreate that experience. So, you know, the thing that we're working on, and we've, you know, announced the game, we've shared some gameplay from it, is so one of the things that Issa Rae's character, Issa D, does in the show is she will rap at herself in the mirror to get herself hyped up, to tackle things like, you know, talking to like romantic entanglements or, you know, co-workers, etc., things like that. So we basically made a rap simulator game, which is all about like the better you get at, you know, putting these rap verses together, the more hyped up you get, and you can sort of spend that as currency in the game. And for us, we were like, you know, how do we mechanically represent Black and brown joy. And like, that's something that's so important to us in terms of like, hey, let's create experiences where you're seen and seen truly, and you know, you are also, you're more than your trauma, which is, I think, definitely a subject that we need to tackle in this in this discussion, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But yeah, I just wanted to speak to that point.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, our first game as our studio is a game called Falcon Age. It's a game about a South Asian young woman growing up in a post-colonial setting. It's sci-fi, but it's very much about British imperialism in South Asia and Sri Lanka. And one of the main characters that you talk to is your auntie, and we wanted to have like, I know I grew up in Sri Lanka, you know, but there's like this idea of a South Asian auntie that is kind of a tropey, but also is very common and realistic, especially in my life. So like, I wanted to have that kind of character represented in a game, which I haven't seen. So it's not just colorizing a character, it's also like bringing in the culture and that experience and information, even in a fictional setting. I think, you know, borrowing from reality and things we're familiar with will hopefully give a different perspective, and that's what we're seeing based on the feedback.
And what's great about, I think, what Eka and Mitu are doing is like all three of us have studios and we're making games at kind of different budget levels, for lack of a better term. And it kind of creates the, we're kind of showing that this is viable from a multitude of different angles. Because like one of the first things like my mother asked me is like, why don't you make so my first project is this game Corner Wolves, and it's in 90s Harlem around the war on drugs, and stars like a Afro-Latina a Dominican mixed with an African-American woman and her life. And one of the first things like my mother asked is like, why don't you make a game about like Punjabi people? Why don't you make a game about us? And I'm like, because at the budget level I'm trying to go at, I can't sell it easily. What I can do is make something that's a little bit more, you know, that still kind of stands for the kind of things I have, and have side characters and build that. And folks like Eka and Mitu are kind of showing this other case by having some South Asian characters and things like that in their games. And eventually, you know, hopefully we get to the point where we're not just having to, you know, take smaller budgets, that we can maybe make in AAA games and stuff like that, and star these characters. That Falcon Age could be a massive game versus a mid-tier game, which is still great as a mid-tier game. You know, the team did an amazing job. There's no shade on any of that, but we need to exist at all levels of this industry. It can't just be white men shooters at the top level, and then all the brown people are literally financially down below.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things I want to sort of add to that as well is, yeah, we have all, like, I'm sure all of us here who have grown up playing games, we've all played as so many different white men, and nobody asks us, like, can we empathize with those characters? Like, we're just expected to, and we always have been expected to, right? But I think there's something interesting in sort of what your mum said, Manveer, about, you know, making a game about Black culture as opposed to Punjabi culture, which is like, actually, I still think there's like, and I'm sure you all feel me as well, like there is something to the ways in which we as minorities can relate to each other's experiences as well, right? And relate to shows and games and representations of beyond, you know, those of our own, but because they're still outside of that white mainstream. I know I love watching like TV shows, which, you know, which is why I'm a fan of Insecure as well. Like, and, you know, again, this is a conversation which I had to sort of prove to a white investor, sorry to frame everything in terms of this is the mode we're in, where, you know, this assumption was like, oh, if you make a show that's a tie-in, if you make a game that's a tie-in to a Black TV show, are you only going to get like, you know, African-American audiences? And, you know, surely you should be making, yeah, a game about a South Asian character or whatever, which it's like, well, no, because the reason that I relate so much to, like, whether it's Insecure or whether it's like Kim's Convenience, which is a great TV show about like about having immigrant parents, like these stories, we can find similarities in them because they're about ultimately existing outside of that white hegemony, and that is so important for us to tell stories to each other about each other's experiences.
Yeah, the universality of the experiences of immigrant families in this country, like I've connected so much over that with people who are not from the similar backgrounds at all. And it's just so important because like, it's like you start talking, it's like, oh, you get me, I get you. I don't have to like start at 101 and explain who I am, where I came from and stuff. Like, we can just talk, you understand I'm loud and I come from a loud people culture, and that's not a bad thing where I come from, right? Versus you go do that sometimes in the office place, maybe you get branded, you know, the loud problematic person. So I absolutely agree with you.
I think it's great that what Eka says about Falcon Age addressing colonial narratives, because this is something that we need to look at in terms of narratives which are created by European supremacy and superiority, because this all plays into, and the seeds are deep, and they the trees that branch from it are the discrimination and inequality that we see today. And if there's one thing I know is a determinant of mental illness, it's inequality. So poverty, homelessness, joblessness, inequality in education, in healthcare, in reproductive rights. And almost all of this is worsened when you are an ethnic minority, or when you are a sexual minority or a gender minority. And so part of tackling these inequalities is tackling the colonial roots of it.
And that actually goes really well into our next question, because we all kind of touched on why it's important to us, but none of us, it's not like all of us just started making games and like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, this is why it's important. We all had to have that moment of, oh, this is why this matters. And, you know, of course, if it's not too personal, do you mind sharing like a moment in either gaming or making games of when representation being important crystallized for you?
I mean, one thing I want to point to is, so I did at a GDC Game Developers Conference 2013, 7 years ago now. Wow. I was invited to do one of the rant sessions. And this is a moment when we had started having these conversations about gender representation in games. You know, like more and more folks were talking about it. We were having reckonings with that, you know, just starting to have reckonings with that. And the thought part crossed my mind of, you know, there's a strand of myself that I've been like chiming in on all the gender representation conversations for sure. But then the thought kind of sparked in my head, like, do I want to talk about race representation? Would that be drawing attention to the fact that I'm a brown woman, right? Which, like, let's speak about survival. Like, you survive by trying to actively not draw attention to that fact, even though everyone knows it. It's ridiculous. It's the ways that we come up in this space, right? So you know, that was a real moment of personal reckoning for me, that I stood up, you know, for like 10 minutes or whatever in front of a room of game developers and ranted about race representation in games. And that was I had to lean into a lot of personal discomfort doing that, because, you know, I'd realized all of the ways in which I'd sort of, you know, made myself small in terms of my identity for so much of my life up till that point, and so as to survive. And I think that since then, and, you know, I think it's an ongoing process still. Like I said earlier on, I'm still thinking a lot to this day about the trauma of having, you know, grown up as someone with my identity. And, you know, it's an ongoing process. So, but I think, yeah, for me, that was like a moment.
For me, I actually spoke at DICE in like 2008 on representation. Hilariously, so it was like I remember it was broadcast on G4 TV when that still existed. I guess that's coming back. But and there was another person, Naveed Kansari, who used to work at Rockstar, was one of the directors on the Grand Theft Auto 3 series, who was a great guy. And when they put our name cards on the TV under our name, under Naveed, they put Manveer Heir, and under me they put Naveed. I'm like, there's two brown people on this panel, and you switched us. And we're like, this is a professional panel. It's supposed to be one of the top conferences in the world for our industry. It's things like that happen all the time, where you kind of take the microaggressions, or even you try to push for design inside your company, but you're inside of a monoculture, and pushing for change inside of a monoculture is often very difficult and is a great path to mental health issues from my personal experience. So one example would be on Mass Effect 3 I worked on and it shipped, and we were generally happy with the way that went, obviously, ending issues aside. And we started on what became Mass Effect Andromeda, which is very different. And one of the first things I pushed for was, hey, in the character creator, I want different hairstyles. I want hairstyles that represent African origin hair, 4C, 4B, curl patterns, things like that. I want, not just the afro and the same two dreads and all of that. And I remember at the very end of the project, I was already done. Like, I was basically, I'm like, the second this ships, I'm out of here. Like, I'm done. And I remember seeing the first version of the character creator come up, and same European version hairstyles and the bald and like the one or two ethnic things. And it's just like, okay, so you all agreed with me verbally for 3 years. We talked about this. We've been doing this, and still ain't nobody changing it. And it doesn't matter to you because you don't get it. And because your teams are not diverse and they're from monocultures, their problems. And when someone like me speaks out, I get upset. So I speak forcefully. So then I become a problem inside the company. And then that's how the monoculture kind of keeps itself. You become a cultural problem. That was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And I have like dozens of examples like that throughout my 15-year career. So I think just like living in this country and then in this industry, working in this industry as a Desi man, and having to deal with the struggles I've had while still, being a cis hetero male and having all those privileges, shows me like how hard it must be for people who don't even have that, who don't have the notoriety or even the experience and level. So it was just that, hey, we gotta do things differently, and change from within is not going to happen. So, I gave up on trying to, I worked for Activision and EA, and I gave up on that, on that, like, hey, to do it that way. And how do I build my own competitor?
Yeah, just to add on to that. So I came to the States when I was 8. My parents, there was a civil war going on in Sri Lanka. My parents wanted for me and my brother and sister to have a better life. So we moved to the States. And so the work ethic, work hard and you'll be rewarded. Like that was their, approach. And that's the thing that I think I kept with me. And I still do for a long time. And my, survivalship, I think, is like, if I just work my butt off, then someone will reward me for it. And I think it took me a long time, and 23 years in games, and I was only one or two of Black or brown folks on any team, which was 99% white males. I think not till like 5-6 years ago, I realized, listen, I'm working my butt off. I'm working harder than a lot of these folks, but like I'm not getting the same sort of opportunities to lead a team or things like that. And that's sort of like a realization, which took me a long time. I think some folks have probably learned that a lot earlier, but like it took me a long time to realize it's not just about working hard. It's like working with the right team and the right people. And that's one of the reasons I decided to start our own studio, because I was like, I'm not getting these opportunities that I normally would on these teams. And only way to change it is be the change.
I mean, for me personally, I guess I have to echo what Manveer was saying, is that I grew up just not expecting for there to be brown heroes, especially within the protagonist role. And then my first experience, I guess, is Dalsim within Street Fighter 2, who is just a complex character in terms of he's a point of pride and a point of shame, in terms of that there is a mixture of the stereotypy of like, he's a yogi who breathes fire, he stretches, he's super starved in certain areas of his body, but also he is pretty much the representation, and he's badass. And so he's not there's not a binary of getting it right or wrong, but there's a mixture. There's a complex thing for us. But that ties into the fact that I generally play Japanese games, and what that means for me is that for a long time I didn't expect POC representation until I started thinking about, well, what ethnicity are these people? And the answer is, if you're not consciously thinking of them as Black or brown, then their default race, they're white. Even if they are made, in Asia, or at least, they're not meant to evoke an ethnicity to you, which just, got me then realizing at some point when I was able to create my own characters, I was making them brown, not through any conscious decision, but like I must have been trying to identify with something there. So I think there's something powerful there. And just to make it clinical, we know that people who immigrants, do have higher rates, not of all mental illnesses, but of psychosis. And then generations following on from immigrants, so generation 1.5 or second generation people do have higher rates of mental illness. And there's so many causes for this, obviously, but one of them, because it happens to subsequent generations, is suspected to be othering and having to acculturize to another country. And so, again, very conceptual and not really backed up by further research, but you'd have to think that helping people maintain their cultural identity once they've gone to a different country would theoretically help their mental health. And so we're not just looking for different skins on people, we're looking for cultural validation in these representations.
And it's interesting you say that, because I think as people who families immigrated, you know, my family immigrated, my grandparents immigrated from India to England when my parents were children. I was born in England and moved to the US when I was 1. So I only know the US really. I don't speak Punjabi. I'm very Americanized. I don't have those cultural links in the same way. Like I went to temple and stuff on Sundays when I was a kid, but there's a lot of things missing because I didn't grow up in this tight community. And interestingly, I just ended up connecting with the people who were around, who were more of like the Black kids and like the Black culture in the region, and found a home there. And then now as an adult, I'm having to kind of do that roundabout thing of like, oh, I've like kind of skipped my own culture, because part of it was when I was a kid, I was ashamed. I was taught to be ashamed of it by the rest of society. And now having to go, oh, not only am I not ashamed, but like I'm extremely proud of who my people are and where we're from and all that. But also I got to learn. I have to do my own like soul searching and figuring that all out. And I think, you know, I'm not going to say that everything would have changed had there been games with my people in them from day one, but I think that would have been one small step to not feeling that level of shame when I was like 7, 8 years old. Or, you know, talk about Street Fighter. Now I remember we would play, I loved Blanca, was my favorite character. And every time I'd go to the kids' houses down the street, hey, you got to play as Dalsum. I'm like, why? Why I got to play as Dalsum? Like, why I got to be him? And it was just like, you know, it was funny to them. And these were my quote unquote, you know, friends, but this was like living in kind of a slightly more rural area in elementary school with white kids. So I think those levels of like how the diaspora has existed and how generationally we have changed and how our children would change. And, you know, it's, you know, that the further along you get away from being from the motherland, the more the culture has changed and shifted. And it's not a bad thing, but we need the ability to be able to be proud and remember where we're from and have that be, you know, something that we can speak to.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of Street Fighter characters, I was always like, do I feel more represented by Chun-Li or Dhalsim? I don't know, I'm gonna pick one. But yeah, I mean, you know, to your point, Sachin, about sort of Japanese games and the representation within those is interesting because, you know, I think that's also a result of global colorism, right? And, you know, how colorism exists in many places. And, you know, and this is, you know, I talk to a lot of people who, especially now and this summer with everything that's happened in the US, you know, a lot of people like to talk about sort of, you know, the ways in which racism is like a US specific problem. And it's like, well, sure, there are specific ways in which, like, you know, there are obviously lots and lots of complex issues to the US specifically, but all of it, like if we think about this in a game systems perspective, right? As game designers, we like to think about complexity arising from simple rules. The simple rule of the world is white supremacy. It's whiteness pitted against, you know, it's whiteness as set up in opposition to, you know, to everybody else, right? And it's like formed as this dominant thing, and sort of the complexity that arises, that rule, that core rule, has played out differently in different places, but it still comes back to the same thing. And that's why, you know, like South Asian culture is very colorist, you know, and East Asian culture is also colorist. And so, you know, and there's colorism all around. So I just want to sort of, you know, mention that.
For me, it was also tied to Street Fighter, seeing Balrog, And it's like, finally, a Black character. And then I'm like, but there's no Black women in here. You know, them playing Tekken and other things. And it's just one of those moments where I'm like, so I don't get to exist except to be like a fighter. And we know that a lot of people don't respect Black folks. So they just see us as animals. They see us as inhuman. I mean, look at Mike Brown, how he was described before the cop shot him. And what crystallized it for me is finally seeing games where I get to exist and not be, you know, a motivation for someone to go out and avenge everybody. Wait, we still don't have that. So I think what crystallized it for me, honestly, is working on Motherlands and seeing the people in chat and seeing the people on Twitter later going, I finally see myself in a game, especially with RPGs, that has a worse race and representation problem than video games. And only getting to have to make my own is how I had that moment. And since I'm already being so cheerful, I want to come back to something Mitu said with our next question before we open it up to Q&A, is you talked about trauma and not just focusing things on our trauma. So I want to talk about the barriers that we all see to representation that we know are there. And, you know, think of it in terms of conceptual versus practical versus financial, because there's very many layers of barriers in getting into having representation. And, you know, and there's a simple barrier of people thinking that we don't even make games, but yet here we all are. So Mitu, since you brought up that earlier, I would love it if you kicked that part of this discussion off.
So in terms of like seeing ourselves in represented in ways beyond trauma, is that kind of yeah? So I mean, I think that you know, there's a lot of conversation. You know, I think one of the things that happens in the mainstream of games sometimes is, you know, the ways in which you know, I think some creators can sort of attempt to try to tackle these issues in a way where it's like, oh, I want to talk about like racism in games, you know, through my game, and I want to represent, you know, the experience of marginalized folks. And, you know, I think for me, the way that I think about it is like, who are you, like, who is your audience, right? Like, who are you trying to speak to? Are you trying to represent like the trauma of marginalized folks, so that, you know, because there's this whole there was that whole movement of empathy games, right? Or the label of empathy games, which is a label that a lot of folks have criticized, and rightly so, because it's a label that assumes that the intended target for that game is somebody outside of that marginalized sphere. And that in itself is the problem, right? Like, we as marginalized players, we're here, we exist, and to have things that are about us and speak to us specifically is something that, you know, I think that's how we begin to heal. Like, honestly, I think rather than being, you know, in this ecosystem, which I believe all of us here are creating together, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great point. I remember, so, you know, a game that got a lot of laud for a lot of good reasons, I think, but, you know, was a Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. And it got, you know, they went out of their way to try to apparently represent psychosis, I think it was, and talk to professionals and the ways to do that. But I also remember reading an article on Polygon from Dia Lucia, I believe her name is, and she's a native queer trans woman who deals with severe mental illness. And she was like, I hate this game because it triggers all of my deep mental illnesses, and like, I can't play more than a chunk at a time. And where are the games for, you know, this is a game for people who don't have this illness to understand it, but like, where's the game for me, someone who lives with this every day, because all this does is trigger me. And I thought that was, you know, I hadn't thought about it in explicitly that way of like, hey, you know, I can see how you get to that point where you're trying to represent mental illness in a more conscious way, and going, but if you don't have the lived experiences, or if you don't have the right ways to do that, or even if you don't know how to talk about it in the correct way, how can you represent it? And then going back to what Mitu said, who is your audience? Is it for people who deal with this already? Is it for other people? These are things that we have to think about all the time on a racial perspective, right? Like, so I'm writing a show right now, Corner Wolves, which is coming out as a narrative podcast first, And, there's a limited number of characters in the podcast, and it's all going to kick off into a video game world eventually. And none of the characters are like white characters. There's no white cops speaking. There's people referenced because the 90s Harlem was mixed and has lots of people, but I focused on a lot of Dominican, Puerto Rican, Black characters for the most part, because I felt like doubling down on that story and making it for people who are in that world to understand is more interesting and more authentic. And I think that authenticity will eventually transition. So to use another example would be a show, The Wire, which is set in Baltimore, not far from where I grew up. And if you watch like the first episode of The Wire, I remember some of my white friends being like, I don't know what anyone's saying. Because like the slang is so Maryland, it's so Baltimore, Maryland, which is very specific slang in Maryland. And like in such a specific way, but eventually like people caught on or could start understanding it and liked it. And that's a show that broke across race barriers for people to be kind of beloved eventually. And I think that authenticity is there. So I like to think about that kind of core all the time. And just that what Mitu said had reminded me of that.
I mean, I think part of what this brings up for me in terms of, who's going to play the game and what they're going to get out of it, it reminds me of mental illness tourism. Like I've worked in the Bethlehem Hospital, which is where the name Bedlam comes from, which used to sell tickets to go see the people who are unwell in a kind of gallery sort of way, which obviously is not practiced anymore in modern times, but it's this sort of, you don't want it to be perverse in terms of it turning into come see what the others live like, almost in a circus type of way. And the flip to that is the people who suffer at the hands of it, which are people who are exploited. Their experiences are used and sold. So Hellblade had, in addition to a neurologist, psychologist, expert input, had a panel of people with lived experience who put their input into it. But then the game gets sold, and where does the money go? And I don't want to focus on Hellblade, but I want to focus on a whole bunch of games. Like Fortnite is always on my mind in terms of selling dances, which come from minority groups, and the money goes to Epic. And so there is this sort of thing of like representation is great, but who prospers from the representation, and who benefits from this being on people's screens, and how we first also protecting the people who put their experiences to page when these things happen.
Eka, did you have anything before we switch over to Q&A?
Sure. I just want to say, like, I think, being a fan of games and making games for a long time, I think there is an audience for a representation. I just don't think we've had the right depth in the characters. White characters in games are allowed to have a lot of variety and a lot of personalities, and I can identify with them, right? Like depending on the personality and how they're written and what they're saying. But like a lot of the black and brown characters in games historically, and even now, it's like they have to represent that whole race and their whole history and everything into one character. And I think my hope, and I'm seeing this change a little bit with shows like Never Have I Ever and even Insecure, like seeing depth of character, like, oh, these are people, not just a monoculture. There's actual characters and stories we can identify with. I think that's what's going to really grow the audience. So that's my hope going forward, that we see more than one brown character and one black character in a game.
Yeah, well, you all are making awesome games, so we'll see more of that. I'm excited. And before I hop into Q&A, there's one thing I didn't get to say while Eka was talking. When I played Falcon Age on stream, everybody was so excited to see Auntie, and then just started telling all the stories about like their families and how they never see this in games. So it was like super exciting and super fulfilling to see that. So unless anyone else has other points they want to bring up, we do have 3 good questions to get through before we end our time. Is there any other point we didn't touch on? Anything you want to bring up really quick?
just quick caveat, which I don't mean to harp on Hellblade at all, because I'm sure that they've donated money to valuable causes centered around mental health. So there is some element of giving back.
Cool.
Well, actually, I'll touch on kind of what you talked about a second ago, which is basically under capitalism, how do we, kind of basically do the quote unquote right thing. And it's difficult because what the rules of capitalism and how it is structured, the structure of it is completely weighted against us on purpose. It is how it decides. We are supposed to be the exploited class in general, not just us, but we are part of that. And some of us are fortunate enough to be rising out of that, but then it becomes that we become on the other side. How do we act differently? And so one thing that I know Eka, myself, Mitu have all talked about privately is that we have to run our own companies different, that we have to be different. As somebody who loved hip hop culture, I was furious to see the Millie Rock and things like that and Fortnite and 2 Million, the folks who invented these things, not, making a dime off of it, and just seeing Black culture exploited once again for, billionaire companies. And, in my head, it was like, okay, well, if I was ever in that position, what would you do different? And the answer for me would be try to find a way to put, if you're putting a dance that's to cut somebody in on some sort of deal, maybe, hey, there's a split when someone buys that emote, I give you a certain percentage, I keep the other percentage, etc. If you're making a game about mental health, donating and stuff like that. But really, there's a structural problem here, and that structural problem is bigger than any individual one of us can handle, and that's capitalism. And there's always going to be a problem under this system with doing that, because we're all making, Mitsu's talked about having to raise money. I've had to go out and try to raise money. Eka's gone out and done the pitching gig. It's hard and it's stressful, and it's doubly hard when you're trying to make something that no one's done before. So like we have to really start deconstructing on, hey, if somehow somebody in this room or somebody we know or somebody that we care about who thinks the right things suddenly had $100 million plus company, or some amazingly one day made a $1 billion plus publisher, how are they going to act differently under the rules of capitalism to not kind of enact the same sorts of problems? And there's not a clear answer on that, but I think we need to be thinking about that all the time.
Absolutely, because as we know, money changes people and not always for the good. Speaking of that, our first question is actually from our Slack. And, whoever wants to take this, feel free. How do you decide when to engage in teaching and pointing out issues, or when you need to take a break and recover / take care of yourself? Basically, where and how do you draw that line? Eka hasn't talked much, so I'm gonna look at you.
I haven't figured that out yet.
Okay.
I think I do it till I burn out, and then try take it. Therapy's helping, which has been huge. That's also a thing that we didn't talk a lot about growing up, but like kind of sort of unpacking a lot of the stuff that I've grown up with, and also trying to actually take time to take stock of how I'm feeling mentally and health wise, and that's how I try to manage. Running a company it's just like there's no break, but I do try to, like in terms of our work culture, we don't crunch, and we try to stop working, don't do anything on weekends and things like that. But like I have to tell myself to do that as well, not just the team, and that's a struggle as you're trying to raise funds and things like that. But like it's an ongoing thing. You just got to constantly just check in on yourself and loved ones around you, make sure you're there.
Yeah. Anyone else want to chime in, or is that basically where we're all at?
I mean, I'm very much the same. I'm very bad at this, and like I've burnt out a couple of times. The one thing therapy and things like that have been helpful, and I certainly, I'm a proponent of that stuff. But it's also just kind of like learning how to change your behavior. So, this year has been hard on everybody for a variety of different reasons, and frankly, I don't even have it that hard personally. But I've had a lot of anxiety issues and stuff. Now, my specialty is working on combat systems in games. I built a Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda combat systems, with a team. I worked on Wolfenstein and shooters before that. So very used to playing action games and combat and stressful kind of games like that. I have realized that when I have anxiety, I can't do that. I can't go play a Tomb Raider or an Uncharted or a Last of Us or anything like that, because it just spikes it to that next level where I can't handle. And so like lately what I realized is like going back to old puzzle games or adventure games. And so then as a creator, that starts making me think of like, well, do you want to make only action games the rest of your career? Do you want to make an adventure game? Do you want to tackle things from different ways? And so like trying to have that kind of honest conversation with yourself is like one of the first steps. But overall, like I definitely do not have the keys to how to do this because I'm still struggling to figure it out myself.
Yeah, I mean, +1 for therapy for all of us, I'm sure. And I really appreciate having your perspective on the panel as well, Sachin. And yeah, I'd love to just, I love hearing all of everything you're bringing to the fore around the research around these things. I think for me, in terms of how I take care of myself, it's hard. Yeah, I also don't know where to draw those boundaries sometimes. One thing that gives me a lot of joy is, in my capacity as an educator, is working with up and coming creators from all kinds of backgrounds, including marginalized backgrounds, because ultimately they're the future of the industry, and just setting them up to be able to be the sort of to be able to express themselves and seeing the things that they're doing, that actually just personally gives me a lot of joy. So it's kind of that's one of the things that one of the ways I take care of myself.
But personally, I definitely agree about taking time for yourself, taking care of yourself. Self-care is all great. I always find it difficult to recommend it to people because I know they know that. And more often the case is they can't do that, as in the system isn't around them to allow them to do that. And so, not to get too political about it, but I mean, Manveer, you already mentioned that capitalism is going to chew you up, and there has to be some power for workers to be able to demand this sort of time to self-care, to not be overworked, for representation. And even in, as we mentioned, I've seen an interview of yours before, actually, Manveer, where you said that actually that if you see a problem in the representation, you've got to keep banging on that door and got to raise the problem. Well, it's got to be safe for you to be able to raise those problems. Because what if, I think I'm the only one who can say this, what if you work in Ubisoft and you're trying to campaign for the woman should be the main character of the next Assassin's Creed game? You got to have an environment where you can be listened to and it's safe for you to be listened to. So I, as part of a doctors' union, would be a hypocrite if I didn't say that there should be some collective power within the games industry.
Yeah, for me, I just know when I try to realize when I'm annoyed, and I know that any question is going to be like, okay, I'm done with you, versus I have the energy to engage. Because a lot of times I find people aren't being honest, they're not being upfront, they just want to have a gotcha. And granted, I take this from Twitter, and I try to spend way less time on Twitter than I used to, which unfortunately isn't as easy as it sounds, because what I do is very online, and it's how I basically got where I am now. But I just kind of step away and I block with no hesitation, and often with a big smile on my face. So getting those people out of your life and not letting them bother you is a big part of self-care for me. Hopefully we can get through the next two questions. I think this one's going to be kind of an easy one if a couple people want to answer. Are things changing in the right direction? Are there any games out there that take that into account?
I'd say all the games that we're creating on this panel, like I said, we're trying to build our own ecosystem, our own structures here. That's what we're trying to do. So yeah, just want to shout out to Brass Lion and to Outer Loop.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shout out to you at Glow Up as well. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always said, things have always been going in the right direction, but moving at a glacier pace is not sustainable. It's not acceptable to me personally. And so, like, can the change happen in our lifetimes? Can it happen in a way so the next generation of developers doesn't have to go through the same kind of problems that the women at Ubisoft and the people of color in this industry have had to go through? things like that. And that is not happening at a pace that is fast enough. And frankly, these studios and these cultures and these multi-billion-dollar corporations only care about the bottom line. So the only thing they're going to listen to is things that impact the bottom line. So as consumers and as citizens and residents of this world, we have to start demanding more from those folks. You know, getting collective power and things like that are also important for the workforces and things like that. But there needs to be deep structural changes to the way everything is, because the status quo is unacceptable. And I don't think anybody who has our experiences would say that it is acceptable. It's at best, like, you can hang on and like make it. And at the end of it, like, if your mental health is gone at the end of it, like, what was the point, right? Like, if you've kind of lost everything, what was the point of the awards aren't going to fix that. So, you know, figuring that stuff out is always going to be the most difficult, and it's going to take a lot of people. And, you know, my hope is that the companies like ours kick off enough of a, you know, show, whether it's just from the business side of things or marketing or whatever it is, that other folks are forced to build competitors towards us, and they're forced to diversify. Like, one of the first things I said to my co-founders, as well as other people that I talked to, was, I want EA and Activision to have to build a studio to compete with me, because I sat there and I tried to do it internally in those studios, and I got egg on my face, and I felt like an idiot for even trying. And it's like, no, I want you to realize that I was right this whole time, and there's a whole group of people that need and want this stuff, and there's a good business reason beside it, so it's not like it's bad business on top of it. And by the time you realize it, you're already way behind where hopefully I am at that point, and hopefully where Eka and Mitu and other folks who are doing this work are. And that's why it's really important to have people working in the AAA space, the, you know, AA, single A space, the mobile space, the indie space. Like, we need to be kind of everywhere. We need to become ubiquitous, because it just needs to be something that is never questioned. And right now we're still in the point where people are questioning it.
Yeah. So, oh, go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, I was going to say there's a lot of great creators, marginalized creators that I'm working with, just helping out every week and as much as I can, just to help mostly with like business side and financial side, hooking up with the right people they need to talk to, because that's the thing that's there's a lot more creators out there now that I'm really happy about. I'm trying to impart any of the things I've learned that have been passed down for other folks down to them, so that they can also have an opportunity in the space to make the games they want to make.
Yeah. So we only have 3 minutes left. So we did get one last question. So if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to read it out, and then maybe we could either give answers to this question in our Slack and it could get tweeted out, or we could talk about it, maybe go a couple minutes over, if that's okay with our hosts. Because it's a good question. I don't want to just totally ignore it, but it's also a big question. It still feels like we're making baby steps. So how do we approach complex and intersectional representation where at best right now we maybe only see a small shard of ourselves, or we only get one aspect of our identity, i.e. the crumbs we're expected to settle for perhaps goes further than mechanical representation?
I think intersectionality is so important. You were talking about Street Fighter doesn't have Black women. Overwatch had such a long wait for Black women. And I can tell you from our government statistics in the UK, they say there's no real significant difference in mental illness between minority ethnic groups and white people. But if you start breaking it down, Black women have worse mental health outcomes than do white women. So when you start getting into these intersectionals, and obviously I can tell you that gender minorities and sexual minorities have far higher rates of mental illness because of what society does to them. So we definitely need to approach things from a more intersectional perspective, but also breaking down binaries. So not saying that, you know, there is this divide male-female, not saying that there's a divide that you're one race or another, or you're one ethnicity or another. Assassin's Creed Liberation is such a good example of this, for having a mixed race heroine who also had some ambiguity of sexuality and also jumped between class structures. She was at sometimes dressed to be amongst the lower class, sometimes amongst the aristocracy. And it really challenged that you could be many different things. And also the fact that then within the narrative, you're playing as her, as whatever identity you are. So, you know, I like the idea of breaking these boundaries down a bit with our games.
One
Yeah,
more
for me, I
person.
always try to just create characters that have those intersections. So creating people from mixed backgrounds who, you know, maybe are non-binary or queer, or, you know, have different levels to who they are, but it's their existence is not just about that. They're a whole person elsewhere. With Corner Wolves, that's something that we are trying to do. Obviously, it remains to be seen if we're successful, but is to try to create kind of whole 360 characters who their gender identity or their sexual orientation or their race or even language is spoken is but a part of who they are, and it's not the entirety of what their existence is about.
I think we also solve this by, as Eka said before, make games where there's just more than one black or brown character, right? If you're representing a whole bunch of characters, like that's the opportunity to tell multiple kinds of stories. So yeah.
Eka or Sachin, last words.
I mean, to reiterate again, like we're trying to do this with our next game, is just a game about arranged marriage and romance and kind of dealing with brown culture, but also colorism and anti-blackism and things like that. And having a range of characters that can talk about that in a meaningful way, I think is one way to solve the problem.
Mitu mentioned going beyond trauma experienced by people. And I just want to say there needs to be more trans people in games, and more trans people in games where it's totally irrelevant, in golf games, in soccer games, in shooter games, where it doesn't matter. It's not about the trauma. There are some games that should address that trauma, sure, but trans people need a lot more representation within games where it isn't about the experience of it.
Absolutely. All right, that concludes our panel. If everybody wants to take a moment to talk about what you do, where we can find you, and how we can support your work. Sachin, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I don't personally exist on the internet. I'm very mysterious. But if you want to check out Gaming the Mind, please go to the Twitter account at Gaming the Mind, all one word, or gamingthemind.org, where you can find out what we do and just hang out with us and stuff.
Right. Manveer.
Yeah, you can follow Brassline Entertainment at www.brasslineentertainment.com, see what we're working on. We have Twitter as well, and you can follow me personally on Twitter or Instagram at King Curry Thunder, though I'm kind of taking a semi-hiatus during these stressful moments that we currently have, so I'm not really posting much or doing much on there currently.
Me too.
I would say please sign up for Insecure, the Come Up game. You can go to glowup.games/insecure. You can also follow me personally on Twitter at MituK or at glowupgames.
Eka.
Yeah, you can find us at Outer Loop Games or my personal Twitter at Ekanaut, EKANAUT, and Falcon Age just released on Switch and Steam today.
Awesome, congrats.
Thanks.
And you can find me as CypherTier online everywhere, and you can follow Motherlands at Motherlands RPG on Twitter, Facebook, and everywhere else. And thank you all for a great conversation and being vulnerable, especially publicly and online. I appreciate all of you.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. We appreciate you.
Tanya.
Thank you, Tanya.
All right, bye, y'all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you all so much for a fantastic panel. That was a delight. We had quite the conversation going on over on Slack, and I'm just really appreciative to all of you.